The first step to turning things around is to admit there is a problem. Only then can you identify the root causes and take steps to fix them. And we're of course talking about the dollar, the linchpin of the entire US economy. Ever since the start of the Ukraine conflict, things have only gotten worse for the reserve currency. According to currency guru Stephen Jan, de-dollarization is happening at a stunning pace. It has dropped from 73% of global reserves to just 58% over the past 2 decades. But if you adjust for price changes, the dollar has actually fallen to 47% in 2022. That's an 8% decline in just one single year. This is equivalent to 10 times the annual pace of the dollarization. This is extremely shocking, and it kind of tells us that dollar dominance is rolling faster than we expected. Now, if you're the United States, you will obviously find this alarming. You will try to make steps to prevent the world from moving away from your currency. After all, it is in your best interest. But that's not what the US government is doing. They are still patting themselves on the back, which is a big disservice to themselves. And this time, Jerome Powell is telling Congress what they want to hear. During a hearing with the House, Congress asked Powell, the US has foreign adversaries, particularly the CCP, that seem intent on de-dollarization. How seriously should the threat of de-dollarization be taken in your view? Now, Powell told Congress what they wanted to hear. Check this out. He said the dollar's reserve status comes from America's great democratic institutions, the rule of law, and price stability. But this is where he really screwed up. When asked if the dollar status is the cause of America's economic dominance or a consequence, Powell told Congress that it is more of a consequence. This is a disaster because it tells us the Fed chair himself is wrong. He's confusing the true reason why the US economy has been dominant. It's because of the dollar. It's not the US economy that's keeping the dollar afloat, it's the other way around. Because America holds the world reserve currency, the US economy has the exorbitant privilege that no other country possesses. According to Peter Schiff, this is exactly the case. Sure, the dollar's reserve status started out as a consequence of America's economic dominance. That is 100% true. Just think back to the gold standard when the currency was backed by physical gold and the US was still a manufacturing superpower. But that has changed. The dollar is now the prop which is maintaining America's economy. And once the dollar's reserve status is lost, US economic dominance will topple. This is very important to understand. If Congress believes the US economy is strong and totally independent of the dollar, then there will be no accountability. The reserve currency will continue to be misused and weaponized. And there's a very good reason why countries are de-dollarizing. They aren't doing it for fun because it is a very painful process, especially in the short term. Because the dollar is the currency of choice for both trade and foreign currency debt, by moving away, countries are actually increasing their transaction costs. But guess what? They are still running away. Putting up a story from Bloomberg, backlash against weaponized dollar is growing across the world. World leaders are looking to lessen their reliance on the greenback because of US dollar weaponization. When you use the reserve currency as a club to clobber nations, they obviously get afraid and they start to move away. And this weaponization is getting worse. We now have US lawmakers moving to fully confiscate Russian assets. They are introducing legislation to give the frozen funds to Ukraine to fight back against Russia. So the Russian reserves could likely be used to prolong the fighting or to rebuild Ukraine after the war. The problem with such a move is the fear other countries have when holding dollars. They might be a friend of the United States today, but who knows what will happen 5 or 10 years down the line. Countries, they are seeing this and they want to escape. So that's why we are seeing the rise of bilateral trade and emerging markets all coming together to plot against the dollar. According to BNP Paribas, America has imposed over 10,000 sanctions over the past 20 years. In fact, it has only gotten worse during the Biden administration. So far, President Biden has imposed more sanctions than any other US president, more than Bush, more than Obama, or even Trump. The dollar has been weaponized like never before during Biden's term more than anyone else. Even Janet Yellen is admitting that using sanctions is sabotaging the reserve status. In an interview with CNN, she admitted the obvious. There's a risk when we use financial sanctions that are linked to the role of the dollar that over time it could undermine the hegemony of the dollar. But even that warning isn't stopping the US from weaponizing it further. So we can expect this state of affairs to continue because that thinking is as backwards. Powell believes the US economy lends strength to the dollar, but it is actually the dollar that lends more economic power to the United States. He is putting the horse before the cart. If Congress understands this, then they can take concrete steps to save the dollar or at least delay the de-dollarization process. If we're going to understand the importance of the dollar, it is the keystone, the linchpin, the fulcrum of the US economy. In the past, the dollar was a consequence of America's economic power, but that was during the good old days. From the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 all the way to the 1980s, that was when the US dollar was at its strongest point. It was backed by gold and the manufacturing power of the United States. Before 1971, countries could still exchange their dollars for physical gold, and the dollar was as good as gold and held intrinsic value. America didn't print money like drunken sailors yet, and countries really trusted the reserve currency. But more importantly, America had a manufacturing output that gave the dollar a ton of value. But the US has lost a ton of manufacturing power to other countries like China and India. And looking at the employment figures in manufacturing, there is a horrible crash in the job numbers. Manufacturing power in America grew steadily after World War II all the way until 1980. After that, it was a downhill crash. It went from over 19 million jobs down to only 11 million jobs. That is almost a 50% drop, and we haven't even adjusted for America's population increase yet. And looking at the manufacturing share of US GDP, it has crashed from a peak of 28% to just 12% in 2015, and in 2021, it is still at 12%. Nothing has changed. US manufacturing has collapsed. Most of the US economy is in the service sector, almost 77%, and that isn't good for the dollar, especially when the world needs tangible goods more. And if we zoom out, we can see America's manufacturing growth is only at 1.2%. Yes, it is better than France or Germany, which is negative. Europe is deindustrializing thanks to higher energy costs, we know that. But manufacturing growth in countries like India and China are growing at nearly 5%. The tangible economies of the BRICS nations are stronger than the G7, which isn't good for the US economy. And this is why Jerome Powell is wrong and Peter Schiff is right. It is the US dollar that is propping up America and not the other way around. The reason why the dollar is the reserve currency is because of the legacy system left in place. It is because of the petrodollar system and the capital markets, not solely because of US economic dominance. So how important is the dollar to the US economy? Let's quantify the advantage the dollar gives to the United States. In early June, Congress had a hearing about how to preserve the dollar's dominance, and they released a very interesting report that tells us how the dollar is keeping the US economy on top of the world. Now, first, the dollar limits the risk of balance of payment crisis for the United States, and this is a very important concept we need to appreciate. A balance of payments crisis is essentially a currency crisis. Because everything is denominated in dollars, countries needed to import key resources like commodities and energy. And they only have two ways to get dollars. Either they earn by selling tangible goods to America, or they sell their currency for dollars in the open market. But America never needs to do that. They can simply print endless amounts of dollars from the Federal Reserve to import stuff. The United States will never have a currency crisis because everything is denominated in dollars. Secondly, a strong dollar reduces inflationary pressure on American consumers. They save up to $45 billion a year because imports get cheaper. So while the world is suffering from an inflation crisis, the United States is insulated thanks to the global rush to safety, a rush into dollars. And this is why countries are being forced to find alternatives. In a report by Bloomberg, dollars are so scarce in Argentina that yuan use is at a record. The yuan share of forex transactions hit a record 28% in June. Because of a massive drought in Argentina, they can't export their crops to earn US dollars. Argentina has no choice but to run to the Chinese yuan. We can see a sudden spike in Chinese yuan usage because the country has a dollar shortage. It went from near zero to almost 30% in a matter of weeks. And this is how fast a country can de-dollarize if they don't have a choice. And guess what? China is taking advantage of this currency crisis to push the yuan out as an international currency. They allow Argentina to use an 18 billion currency swap line to support trade between them. They are bypassing the dollar in trade. China is de-dollarizing the world because the dollar is like a wrecking ball. Honestly, this information is so essential, guys. Many people still don't know this, and this needs to be taught at every economics class. But here's the true advantage the US economy gets from the reserve currency. Consumers, businesses, and the federal government enjoy lower borrowing costs by as much as 60 basis points. And this is the big one that many people underestimate. Sure, 0.6% doesn't sound like a lot, but in aggregate, it is a massive advantage. Because a ton of money flows into US treasuries, this pushes down yields, which makes borrowing money cheaper in the United States. And that's why the dollar keeps the US economy propped up. It gives US companies access to cheap capital to outspend their competitors. You have zero currency risk, and now you can take cheaper loans. And the problem with Powell's thinking is that it removes the dollar as a driver of the US economy. It introduces zero accountability for the reserve currency, and there's only so much you can abuse the dollar before the entire world loses trust. So if you're the US government, there are only three ways you can protect or harm the dollar's reserve status, and it's quite shocking that they are making horrible decisions for each one. The first is weaponizing the dollar, and as we know, it won't stop. But let's talk about the other two because they are even more important than dollar sanctions, and those are fiscal and monetary policy. And let's get real about fiscal policy here. It is a complete mess. America can't stop spending and borrowing money. The US national debt has now crossed over $32 trillion. That is an insane amount of money. It is more than the value of the economies of China, Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. We need to wake up. Now, you might be thinking, so what, guys? It doesn't matter. The world will always buy US treasuries, but that is not a guarantee. As de-dollarization progresses, there will be less money flowing into US bonds, especially from countries like China or even Saudi Arabia one day. And that is a real problem if the United States Treasury can't find enough buyers for their bonds. You have to raise yields, which will jack up the cost of borrowing. And this is exactly what happened during the debt ceiling crisis. During that period, buyers were so afraid of America defaulting, so they avoided US bonds like the plague. And the fear was so great that in May, yields for June treasuries spiked well above 7%, and that is insane. So just imagine how much higher borrowing costs will go. If the dollar loses reserve status, we could be seeing double-digit yields in a tight squeeze. And that's why Powell is doing a great disservice to the dollar by saying it's a byproduct of a strong US economy, and by saying that it feeds into poor fiscal policies even further. It will cause the national debt to keep ballooning up to protect the US economy until one day the bubble will just explode, right? And there will either be an incredible default by not paying and sticking it to the bondholders, or inflating the debt away by money printing. And when that happens, we will most certainly dethrone the dollar as the world reserve currency. And because Powell believes the US dollar is only a tool, when the time comes, the Fed is going to reinflate the balance sheet once again. They'll stimulate the US economy. And this means buying a ton of bonds to bring down yields of US treasuries. We just need to look at the Fed's balance sheet, guys. Every time there's a crisis, their default response is to buy tons of bonds and inject liquidity into the system. They did it back in 2008 and then in 2020 again. Remember when the Federal Reserve buys bonds, it lowers yields and pumps the banks full of cash reserves. And this lays the foundation for another inflation crisis down the road when the banks finally start lending the money out again. So expect inflation to never end and the dollar to keep losing purchasing power, because the Fed's real directive here isn't really to protect the dollar but to protect the US economy. And here's the truth. In order for the dollar to remain the reserve currency of the world, the impossible has to happen. The Fed will have to stop intervening in the markets, and that means no stimulus, no manipulating interest rates, and allowing the free market to really decide. Let the market set the interest rates. Then you need Congress to stop spending money and reduce the national debt. In 2022, Congress borrowed $1.38 trillion to run the country. That is 22% of total spending, which is pushing America closer towards an eventual default, but it's going to be hard to stop. That means cutting down military spending, which we know won't happen, especially with the war going on. America just announced another $2.1 billion for Ukraine, so fiscal discipline won't happen anytime soon. And finally, weaponizing the dollar has gotta stop. It is giving China and Russia the ultimate excuse to de-dollarize the world. In a recent op-ed by Marco Rubio, America is finally freaking out about the dollar losing reserve status to China. And a big part of it is thanks to dollar sanctions. Listen to what Marco said. If you sanction enough countries, you create a common market of economies that have an interest in an alternative way to conduct business with one another. And that's why we are seeing a ton of bilateral deals happening. That's also why over 20 countries are looking to join BRICS. They are all hunting for alternatives to the dollar. However, guys, it might be too late to turn back the clock. Even though America might be aware of de-dollarization, there's almost nothing done to reverse course. And if the dollar loses the reserve status, the next to go will be US hegemony. Sure, this process won't be an overnight affair, but it is definitely accelerating. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Is the US dollar a big reason for US hegemony? Or is the US economy really the driver of the dollar's reserve status? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.